Now, I shall enjoy telling you about the lives of elegant and exceptionally wealthy gentlemen like myself, who enjoyed the best of everything and generally lived to enjoy a port-sodden old age. And I'll be telling you what the other 94% of us who were downstairs were getting on with while they were living the life of Riley.
And between us, you'll end up with a slightly better idea of what really went on upstairs and downstairs, and occasionally in my lady's chamber. Our part of the world's awash with wonder-filled country houses. But in this series I'll be looking less at the art and architecture and more at the rich folk in their castles and the poor folk at their gate. This week at Felbrigg Hall I'll be taking the heat in the kitchen, taking a proprietary stroll in the woods, and taking exception to the unsavoury smells of servants taking the pee.
Oh, please.
Girls! God help us, you giddy gadabouts, be attentive. I've just heard there has been an outbreak of cholera in that cesspool that some people call Cromer.
Oh dear.
How sad. Never mind.
It is my intention from memory to make Dr. Lubbock's receipt for the prevention and cure of cholera. Now, I will require 6 drops of essence of peppermint, 1 rounded dessert spoon of essence of rhubarb, and 6 drops, no more, no less, 6 drops of laudanum. You might think we've got a drug problem. They regularly took laudanum to calm their nerves in these days. It's tincture of opium. I bet it calmed their nerves. You, look, just come here and look decorative. Oh, demurely. Good. Now, quickly. Opium. And you top it all up with a good full measure of best French brandy. Well, when you consider this has got opium and brandy, who cares if you catch the cholera? That ludicrously unlikely cure against the cholera was the work of Felbrigg Hall's most accomplished mistress, Catherine Wyndham. For nearly 250 years, the Wyndham family lived here. And that's its real charm. Felbrigg's not an intimidating power play of a stately pile. It's more a comfy, cosy country home. It was William Wyndham I who shaped the Felbrigg we see today. Although he doubled the size of the original, he built for convenience and pleasure rather than politics and power. These elaborate plaster ceilings of the 1700s looked down on rooms that were framed in oak and beech from his own estate, timber which his far-sighted forebears had planted for him, and which he, like many another gentleman, carefully replanted for his successors. When William died, his wife Catherine took over the running of Felbrigg, and even after her son Ash came of age, she was still the prime mover there for over 40 years.
Catherine Ashe was a remarkable woman. She really was a wonderful match for William in that she was intelligent, she was competent, she ran a household, she ran the estate when he was not around. She she wrote her own books, her own cookery book, her own medicinal book, her own recipes. She and her sister corresponded daily, swapping recipes. She spoke French. She played music. She was a very, I think, a remarkable woman for the time.
Catherine's household book is a rare and intimate glimpse of the everyday life of a country gentlewoman. Now, Catherine's book, because of its rarity, is actually held not at the house, but at the County Archive in Norfolk, here in Norwich, and we've had permission to come down and have a play. I mean, it's just lovely to think that I'm holding a book which Catherine held and wrote in herself. This is all in her own hand. And there's just wonderful recipes here, making a calf's head pie, how to use a calf's head and remove the bones and then dress it to make it look like sturgeon. Nice bit of domestic economy, because sturgeon would cost an arm and a leg because it had to be brought all the way from Russia. But there's all sorts of recipes here that gives you a glimpse of the sort of diet that people had. She was a bit of a herbalist as well. A woman was expected to be skilled in the arts of the still room, distilling liquors and distilling cordials for the health of the family. This is concerning bugs. It says that you're very likely to find bed bugs biting you during the night. Okay, bear in mind these people are at the top of the economic tree and they're even being bothered by bed bugs. But she suggests that one of the things you should do is take lemon juice and mix it with wormwood and smear it about your neck and face to stop the bed bugs biting, which explains something I've always wondered about, because it's common where I live for people to say, night, night, hope the bed bugs don't bite. I've always thought really strange, but clearly biting bed bugs were a big problem in the past.
Can you possibly imagine what it must have been like trying to prepare for a great feast here at Felbrigg? I mean, it must have needed what amounted to a military... Oh, I could get used to this. It must have needed what amounted to a near military operation. No accident, I'm sure, that all of these pots and pans were known as the batterie de cuisine. It was like a siege going on. And of course, these things, you see them hanging up in stately homes now, and they don't really convey anything of what they meant, the reality that they meant for the people that worked in these kitchens. And of course, the bit I really love, which gives the wrong impression entirely, are the jelly molds. Everyone comes in and goes, oh, wow, they must have loved jellies and blancmange. You see, these weren't just for jellies and blancmanges. They were more often than not for main courses. You see, the gentry and the aristocracy had such sugar-rich diets that very often, many of them, had such appalling tooth decay that they couldn't possibly eat and chew the sort of foods that were generally served up at table. Unlike the servants, who, because they were generally on a poorer, slightly poorer diet, didn't have all that tooth-rotting stuff going into their system. So for a lot of them, they would have, well, what amounted to a blancmange of beef ground up, or pâté de foie gras, or duck, or whatever, so that they didn't have to chew their way through it. They could eat it because it was blancmange consistency. This is one of the few occasions when the nature of the relationship between the master and his servants worked very definitely in favour of the servants.
Now, the rigid hierarchy of a country house made it all but impossible for servants to have any kind of romantic relationship. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, few employers would countenance a marriage between two of their servants. Meetings must have been hurried and furtive, but love and lust must have found a way, if the number of pregnant maids was anything to go by.
If a maid was found to be pregnant, then normally they would be hastily driven out of the household, so to speak, told to return to their families. Sometimes it so happened that a pregnancy occurred and a birth occurred without anyone really being aware of it. I suppose voluminous clothes at the time made that just a bit easier. There was always a fear, of course, that if that happened and the maid were determined to keep the birth a secret, that she might commit infanticide, and certainly some of them did.
This is actually a tale I want to tell you about romance and tragedy, and it's quite poignant. This is Hester Buckworth. She was the dearly beloved fiancée of Ash Wyndham. Ash Wyndham was the owner of Felbrigg in the early 1700s, and being young and impressionable, he fell hopelessly and utterly in love with Hester. As well as showering all his love and affection on her, he showered huge amounts of expensive jewellery, which caused his mother Catherine a little bit concerned. And you have to imagine that she wasn't terribly happy at the prospect of having her as a daughter-in-law, not because she didn't like her, but because it would mean that as the dowager, she would have to move away from Felbrigg. And she loved Felbrigg as much as Ash loved Hester. Unfortunately, Hester did the dirty on Ash. She very selfishly
died of smallpox before they could be married. Now, that was actually very tragic for her and devastating for Ash. He was besotted with her, and really the only reason he went on to marry somebody else, a lady called Elizabeth Dobbins, was because he was obliged as a landed gentleman to ensure the continuation of the House of Wyndham. And so he duly did his duty with Elizabeth, had a son, and then promptly their marriage fell apart. Now, some people have actually offered the opinion that Ash, as he came up and down this staircase throughout the remainder of his life, must have taken comfort from the fact that he could still gaze on the face of dear darling Hester. Call me old-fashioned, and I don't want to be overly cynical, but I wonder if the fact that Ash had a 5-foot square portrait of his former mistress hanging about the house might just have had something to do with the fact that his marriage didn't go quite the way he wanted it to. One rather suspects that had she been able to give us an interview, his wife might have said, "Well, there were always 3 of us in this marriage."
Coming up in a moment, I'll be going down to the woods.
Oh, don't pretend to look busy.
Burning with curiosity about the Felbrigg Fire Brigade, and telling you just how William Wyndham waved goodbye to the family fortune. This week's look at Masters and Servants brings me to Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk, where I'll tell you the tale of the toff, the tart, and the police constable's uniform. The remarkable woods at Felbrigg Hall are almost as famous as the house itself, and not simply for the rather beautiful young women you find walking there. These gals are just passing the ice house. You see, all the big houses had their own ice houses for storing ice gathered from the lakes and flooded meadows in winter, which would be used for sorbets in summer. In 1822, someone had the bright idea of importing it from Norway, but Customs and Excise took so long to classify it as dry goods that by the time they got it out of bond, it had melted away. Anyway, that's not why we're here. Pan the camera, give me a sylvan scene of horny-handed woodsmen about their laborious but honest toil, cameraman.
Oh, don't pretend to look busy. Now, I'm in the woodlands behind Felbrigg House, except they're very special woodland. Throughout the Middle Ages, people actually managed the natural woodland. They cut the trees down, they coppiced them, they pollard them, and they would keep regrowing. But it was William Wyndham I who was one of the first people in this country to realise that it wasn't going to be enough just manage the resources nature provided. What you'd have to do was to actually plant your own woodland from scratch. And was he doing it? He was doing it like all good landowners to make sure that his progeny, his future generations, would not run out of the most valuable of resources that an estate could produce, wood. You needed oak and you needed beech for just about everything you could possibly want to do around the house.
His farsightedness was a blessing to his grandson. Less than 100 years later, William Wyndham II needed a grand library to house the books he collected on his grand tour, and Grandad's trees were perfect for the job. Now, William's travels and acquired tastes included the somewhat unorthodox practice of encouraging his servants to educate themselves. He provided a small, or tiny, portable library for their edification. The Wyndhams were unfashionably keen to educate their servants, and many were taught the basics of reading and writing. Generally, though, educating the poor was seen as prejudicial to their morals and happiness. It will teach them to despise their lot in life. Others, however, said it was only through education that the poor would become acquainted with the duties they owe to society. A dangerously radical notion. Next thing you know, they'll be going to university and starting to think for themselves.
Now, sir, what are you smacking at? You may carry on, would you, please? William's attitude, I think, he was an impulsive man, and he could lose his temper, but he was very just. I mean, we have records of him paying off servants who misbehaved, but they got their wages and they got the clothes on their back, and he made sure they had a reference, which wasn't too damning. So he was better than most, perhaps, but I'm sure he had his bad moments. I'm sure he did.
Now, the servants' stair, or the back stair, was a hugely important development in the history of the house. What are you complaining about? It's only a bucket of coal. Come on, go and set the fire. Think what you're saving on aerobics classes. Thing is, 2 tons of coal had to come up the stairs at Felbrigg every single week just to feed the pot-bellied stoves and the fireplaces on the upper floors. Now, that was a huge amount of... What are you sounding so happy about?
It's a new handle oratorio, it's magic.
Oh, good. Carry on. Just don't let the water get cold. See, the thing is, there was huge amounts of water coming up for people to wash and shave. I mean, they'd occasionally have a hip bath which needed to be filled, but they didn't have the same ideas about personal hygiene that you and I would have. But it still meant that people had to carry it all up. And worst of all was the fact that the clothes stool, the place where they went to... Oh, please. Is his lordship still got this fondness for that foreign muck he got a taste for in France? Sink an elephant, that would. Listen, the thing is, it would be an extremely dignified and grand personage who could cope with walking up to the library on the main staircase and be confronted by his own pile of poo from the night before being brought down in a gazunder to be dumped into the earth closet outside. And so when the back stair was invented, they must have gone, hallelujah, because it meant that things like that could now be put out of sight along with the servants. And these elegant, refined corridors could be left for the likes of us to swan about in without being interfered with by people with noxious smells under our noses.
The other great change is that much more specialisation. In the 18th century, it was still possible to move from being a housemaid to being a nursery maid to being a dairy maid. That literally did happen in some families at the beginning of the 18th century. In the 19th century, in a large household, specialisation, expertise, all of that became important.
Oh, I could spend weeks happily trolling through this. This is a 19th century rent book, but it's more than just a list of the rents. It's all the visits that were needed and the conversations that took place. Because this is actually the estate office, and this was the nerve centre of the estate, this complex machine which existed to provide rents and monies to underwrite this whole lifestyle. And conscientious people like Wyndham would come down on a daily or at least a weekly basis when they were here to confer with the estate manager to make sure that everything was going the best possible way. But he would then continue on to special rooms that he'd equipped at the far end of this service wing, because he did something which very few gentlemen did. He did manual labour. Well, quite skilled manual labour, Remember, a gentleman doesn't do anything which a servant could do in his place. But Wyndham didn't go along with that. And he actually had 2 very large wood-turning lathes installed so that he could teach himself how to turn wood. The other thing that he was hugely passionate about was fireworks. He was, to use the terminology of those days, a fireworker general. And he writes regularly to his steward saying, be absolutely certain that the fireworks are stored at the right temperature. And that was why they had to have a small pot-bellied stove in the room where the fireworks were stored. Yeah, you can see where this story's going, can't you? Yep, it happens. Either through neglect or through over-enthusiasm, someone stoked up the fire a little too high one day, and boom, the whole thing just went skywards. The roof of that particular part of the building was found several hundred yards away in the woodland behind the house. As a consequence of all this, Wyndham had the bright idea, although a little late in the day, to order up a whole load of leather buckets in case it should ever happen again, and this time to be prepared. And just to make assurance double sure, getting all Shakespearean on you here, he actually ordered up the very latest fire engine. Now, I'm sorry it's not a huge, big, bright red, pillowbox red Dennis, but this, in the 1750s, was state-of-the-art firefighting. Big pump handles that you lifted up and down and drew the water out of a nearby pond, and it all came out through this nozzle here. Oops. Please do not touch. I didn't see that. Shh, don't tell anyone.
The fortunes of the Wyndham family didn't survive the misfortune of having this little fella in the line of succession. Say hello to another William Wyndham, known to history as Mad Wyndham. He seems to have spent most of his time with the servants in the kitchen. His parents encouraged him and had a little red and blue uniform made for him, an exact miniature version of that worn by the other servants. William's behaviour became more and more eccentric. He was obsessed by trains, and he used to cause chaos by dressing up as a very convincing-looking guard and blowing his whistle and sending trains out of the station ahead of their schedule. William was 18 and just out of Eton when he inherited Felbrigg. He'd regularly make trips to London where he'd dress as a policeman and patrol the notorious Haymarket, where he met and later married Agnes Willoughby, the original tart without a heart. She systematically set about getting her hands on his fortune, and soon after their son was born, she left him, taking just about everything he owned. The penniless William finally fulfilled one of his life's ambitions when he became the coachman on the Norwich to Cromer Express coach.
Thank you very much, my good man.
They're their own handcuffs.
Poor Mad Wyndham was clearly certifiably insane, but he certainly wasn't stupid if the shape of Agnes was anything to go by. Sadly, it was the beginning of the end for the Wyndhams and for Felbrigg. Despite the efforts of the people that came after him, they were never able to get over the depredations he inflicted on the estate. So eventually, I think in the 1960s it was, the place was handed over lock, stock and barrel to the National Trust, which means, chummy here, your prospects ain't looking so good, are they? Fancy a pint?
Not a half. I thought you never asked.
Hey, just wish you lend us 20, could you? Because I'm a bit short. Come on, I'll see you all right. I know a really good place up at Old South.
Next time, I'll be going back to the Middle Ages to dispel a few myths about eating habits. I get caught up in the Civil War, and I meet an Irish Charles Dickens telling tales at Rockingham Castle.